I woke up on the morning of my 23rd birthday with the strangest sense of clarity, as if I'd lived this exact moment before. The sunlight filtered through my bedroom curtains in the same pattern it had always done, but something felt different. My hands looked younger. The scar on my wrist from the accident 3 years ago, gone. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding with a recognition I couldn't explain, and reached for my phone on the nightstand. The date confirmed what my body already knew. March 15th, 2019, 5 years earlier than it should be. I'd been given another chance. The memories came flooding back in waves. The betrayal, the isolation, the cold water of the lake closing over my head, the absolute certainty that I had nothing left to live for. And now, impossibly, I was here again, back at the beginning of it all, with the knowledge of everything that was coming. I sat on the edge of my bed for 20 minutes, just breathing, testing the reality of this moment. My apartment looked exactly as it had. The same cheap furniture from college, the same motivational poster Emma had given me as a joke, the same stack of work files on my desk. Everything familiar, everything the same. Except me. I wasn't the same Jenny who'd woken up that morning 5 years ago, eager and naive, and so desperate for her family's approval that she'd have given away anything they asked for. I knew what that desperation had cost me. The first time I lived through this day, I'd been too distracted by excitement to notice the warning signs. Mum had called me downstairs with that particular tone in her voice, the one that meant she needed something but would frame it as a favour I should be grateful to provide. I'd bounced down the stairs in my pyjamas, oblivious, ready to celebrate turning 23. This time, I walked down slowly. Each step felt deliberate, weighted with knowledge I shouldn't possess. Mum sat at the kitchen table with Dad, their breakfast half eaten. My sister Emma stood by the counter, stirring her coffee with studied casualness. The scene was so familiar it made my chest ache. "Jenny, honey, sit down," Mum said, gesturing to the empty chair. "We need to discuss something important." I sat up. I already knew what was coming, but I let the moment unfold naturally. "Your sister's getting married," Dad announced, his voice carrying that forced cheerfulness he used when delivering news he knew I wouldn't like. "Isn't that wonderful?" "Congratulations," I said to Emma, keeping my voice neutral. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Thanks. We're thinking June, a summer wedding." Mum leaned forward, her hands clasped together in that way that meant she'd already made a decision, and was now going through the formality of presenting it to me. "The thing is, we need to talk about Grandma's house." There it was, the house my grandmother had left specifically to me in her will 2 years ago. The small, perfect cottage on Maple Street, with the garden she taught me to tend, the kitchen where we'd baked together, the porch where we'd watched storms roll in. My inheritance, my sanctuary. "What about it?" I asked, though I remembered this conversation word for word from my first life. "Emma needs a proper wedding," Mum said. "Something memorable, and the venue she's fallen in love with is quite expensive. We've looked at the numbers, and if you sold Grandma's house, it would cover the wedding costs perfectly. You'd still have some left over." I stared at her. In my first life, I'd protested weakly, then caved under the weight of guilt and obligation. They'd told me I was being selfish. That family came first, that Emma had always been there for me, and this was my chance to be there for her. They told me I could always buy another house, but Emma would only get married once. That last part had turned out to be prophetic in ways they hadn't intended. "No," I said quietly. The kitchen went silent. Dad's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. Emma's stirring stopped. Mum's expression shifted from confident to confused. "I'm sorry?" Mum said. "I said no, I'm not selling Grandma's house." "Jenny, don't be ridiculous," Dad said, setting down his cup with more force than necessary. "It's just sitting there. You barely visit it. Emma needs this. Grandma left it to me, I replied, my voice steady. She wanted me to have it. I'm keeping it. Emma's face flushed. Seriously? You're going to ruin my wedding over a house you don't even use? I looked at her, really looked at her. In my first life, I'd sold the house. I'd given them the money. Emma had gotten her dream wedding at the Crystal Gardens, the most expensive venue in the city. 300 guests, champagne fountains, a dress that cost more than some people's cars. And 6 months later, she'd divorced her husband after discovering he'd been cheating with her maid of honor. But that wasn't why I died broken and alone in my first life. After the wedding, after I'd given away my inheritance, I'd had nothing left. No savings, no property, no backup plan. When I'd lost my job during the economic downturn, I'd had to move back in with my parents. They'd resented me for it. Emma had looked at me with pity and disdain in equal measure. I'd become the family disappointment, the daughter who couldn't get her life together. And when I'd met Daniel, I thought I'd finally found someone who saw me, someone who valued me. I'd been so desperate for love that I hadn't noticed he was using me, that he'd come to family dinners and charmed my parents while slowly isolating me from everyone else, that he'd borrowed money he never repaid, that he'd moved into my parents' house with me and treated it like a hotel while I worked 2 jobs to support us both. The day I discovered he was also seeing Emma, my own sister, I'd felt something inside me simply stop. I hadn't confronted them, I'd just walked out, driven to the lake where Grandma used to take me, sat by the water as the sun set. I'd meant to just think, to process, to figure out what to do next. But the pain had been too heavy, the betrayal too complete. I'd walked into the water fully clothed, and I'd kept walking until I couldn't walk anymore. They'd found my body 3 days later. "Jenny?" Mum's sharp voice cut through my memories. "Are you even listening to me?" I blinked, focusing on the present, on this second chance I'd been given. "I heard you. The answer is still no." "You're being incredibly selfish," Emma said, her voice rising. "This is my wedding, my special day, and you can't even help your own sister." "I'm not stopping you from having a wedding," I said calmly. "I'm just not selling my house to pay for it." Dad stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "That house is too much for you anyway. You're a single girl living in a 1-bedroom apartment. What do you need with property?" In my first life, that comment had stung. Now, I recognised it for what it was. A rationalisation. They'd already decided I should sacrifice my inheritance. They were just looking for ways to make me agree. "It's my decision," I said simply. Mum's expression hardened. "Fine, but don't expect any help from us when you need it. You're on your own." I stood up, leaving my breakfast untouched. I always have been. I walked out of the kitchen and heard Emma's voice rise behind me. "She's unbelievable, after everything we've done for her." I kept walking, up the stairs, into my old bedroom, and closed the door behind me. My hands were shaking, but not from fear or doubt, from relief, from the knowledge that I'd just changed everything. The weeks that followed had a dreamlike quality. I knew what was coming because I'd lived it before, but the details shifted now that I'd changed the first domino. In my original timeline, I'd been so consumed with guilt about refusing to help Emma that I'd barely noticed when Daniel Reeves started working in my office building. He'd seemed to appear everywhere I went, the coffee shop, the gym, the grocery store. He'd struck up conversations that felt natural and unplanned. He'd asked me out with a shy smile that made him seem harmless. This time, when he approached me at the coffee shop on March 28th, I saw him clearly. The practiced casualness, the calculated charm, the way his eyes assessed my clothes, my bag, my phone, cataloguing my worth. "Hi," he said, sliding into the seat across from me without asking. "I'm Daniel. I've seen you around the building. You work for Morrison Tech, right?" "I do," I said neutrally. I just started in the marketing department. He flashed that smile, the one I'd once found endearing. This city is new to me. I don't really know anyone yet. In my first life, I'd felt sorry for him. I'd offered to show him around. I'd been kind. There's a newcomers meetup group that meets Thursday nights at the library, I said, standing and gathering my things. They're very welcoming. Good luck with the new job. I left before he could respond. Outside, the spring air felt clean and sharp. I walked back to my office with my head high, feeling more powerful than I had in years, in either life. That evening, I drove to Grandma's house for the first time since my rebirth. The key still fit perfectly in the lock. The door still creaked in that familiar way. The smell of lavender and old wood still hung in the air, even though she'd been gone for 2 years. I walked through each room slowly, touching the furniture, remembering. The kitchen table where we'd rolled out pie dough. The living room where she'd taught me to knit. The bedroom where she told me stories about her own grandmother, creating a chain of women stretching back through generations. I'm sorry I gave this away before, I whispered to the empty house. I won't make that mistake again. Emma's wedding planning consumed my parents' house like a fog. Every conversation revolved around flowers, seating charts, menu tastings. They'd taken out a loan to cover what they could afford, but it wasn't enough for Emma's vision. The gap between their budget and her dreams grew wider each week. I stayed away. I visited Grandma's house instead, spending weekends cleaning it out, repairing the garden, painting the shutters. Each hour I spent there felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. The garden had become overgrown in the 2 years since Grandma's death. Weeds choked the flower beds. The tomato cages had fallen over. The herb garden had gone to seed. But the soil was still good, rich and dark. The bones of her work remained. I spent an entire Saturday on my knees in the dirt, pulling weeds, turning soil, replanting. My muscles ached, my hands blistered, and I felt more alive than I had in years. On a Sunday in April, I was planting tomatoes when Emma showed up. She stood at the garden gate, looking out of place in her designer jeans and silk blouse. Nice garden. Thanks. I didn't stop working. Mom and Dad are furious with you. I know. They don't understand why you're being so stubborn about this. I sat back on my heels, wiping dirt from my hands. Do you remember when we were kids and Grandma taught us to make pie crust? Emma frowned. What does that have to do with anything? You kept saying it was too hard, that your hands were tired. Grandma told you that anything worth having requires effort. You said you'd rather just buy pie from the store. So, you've spent your whole life looking for shortcuts, I said quietly. My inheritance isn't your shortcut to a perfect wedding. Her face flushed red. You're a terrible sister. Maybe, but I'm the one who actually listened to Grandma. She left without another word. I watched her car pull away, then went back to my tomatoes. The plants were small now, fragile things that needed staking and support. But by summer they'd be strong. They'd bear fruit. All they needed was time and care, like me. At work, I started making different choices. In my first life, I'd been timid, afraid to speak up in meetings or advocate for my ideas. I'd watched as male colleagues took credit for my work, as my suggestions were ignored until someone else repeated them. This time, I spoke up. When my manager, Robert, dismissed my proposal for streamlining the customer database, I didn't let it go. I put together a detailed presentation showing the time and cost savings, the improved user experience, the competitive advantage. I requested a formal meeting with the department head. Robert was furious. You went over my head. I followed the proper channels for proposing initiatives, I replied calmly. My email to you outlining the project is dated 3 weeks ago. When I didn't receive a response, I escalated appropriately. The project was approved. I was given a small team to implement it. And 3 months later, when it reduced customer service response time by 40%, I was promoted. Robert left the company shortly after. I didn't gloat. I simply did my work and built my reputation. The promotion came with a significant raise. I opened a separate investment account and started researching opportunities. I knew which tech startups would explode in the next 2 years. I knew which established companies would stumble. I knew where to put my money to watch it grow. By June, my savings had tripled. In my first life, Emma had married Thomas Wright at the Crystal Gardens on June 15th. It had been elaborate, excessive, and ultimately empty. The marriage had lasted 7 months. This time, with a smaller budget, she settled for the Riverside Inn. It was pretty enough, a Victorian mansion with garden views, but it wasn't the social statement she'd dreamed of making. I wasn't invited to the wedding. Mum called 2 days before to tell me they'd decided my presence would create tension and ruin Emma's day. I was welcome to skip it. "Okay," I said. "That's it? Just okay?" "What else do you want me to say?" "I want you to care," she said, her voice tight. "I want you to act like you're part of this family." "You uninvited me to my sister's wedding," I replied. "You're the ones deciding I'm not part of the family." She hung up without responding. The day of Emma's wedding, I woke up early and drove to the city's commercial district. I'd been researching property investments for weeks, building on knowledge from my first life. I knew which neighbourhoods would boom, which businesses would fold, which opportunities would emerge. The Crystal Gardens, the venue Emma had desperately wanted, was struggling financially. In my first timeline, they'd stayed afloat long enough to host Emma's wedding, then filed for bankruptcy 6 months later. The property had sat empty for 2 years before being converted into condos. This time, I'd gotten there first. I met with the owner, Mrs. Patricia Aldrich, in her office overlooking the main ballroom. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the crystal chandeliers that gave the venue its name. "You're quite young to be looking at a property like this," Mrs. Aldrich said, studying me over her reading glasses. "I have the funds," I assured her, "and a vision for what it could become." I'd sold several small investments from my first life, stocks I knew would crash, bonds I knew would fail. I'd moved my money into opportunities I knew would succeed. In 5 months, I'd tripled my modest savings into something substantial. Not enough to buy the Crystal Gardens outright, but enough for a significant down payment and a strong loan application. Mrs. Aldrich reviewed my financial statements. "What would you do with the venue?" "Keep it running," I said, "but more efficiently. You're pricing yourself out of the market. Most couples can't afford your rates, so you're dependent on a handful of luxury events per year. If you broaden your offerings, create tiered packages, you could host multiple events per week instead of one per month." She was quiet for a long moment. "You've done your research." "I have. I also know you're 3 months behind on your mortgage payments. I know your main event coordinator quit last month and you haven't found a replacement. I know you're considering bankruptcy." Her expression tightened. "You're very informed." "I'm offering you a way out," I said gently. "You keep 10% ownership. You stay on as a consultant for the first year, teaching me the industry. You get to see your venue succeed instead of watching it die. And you walk away with enough money to retire comfortably." She stared at me for a long time. This place was my daughter's dream. Catherine. She passed away 3 years ago. Cancer. She was only 31. I've been trying to keep it alive for her memory, but I'm tired. I'm ready to let someone else carry it forward. "I'll honour what she built," I promised. "I'll make it better." We negotiated for 2 hours. In the end, I left with a contract to purchase the Crystal Gardens, contingent on final financing approval. I drove to Grandma's house and sat on the porch, watching the sun set through the oak trees. Somewhere across town, Emma was having her reception at the Riverside Inn, dancing with her new husband, cutting a cake that was elegant but small, celebrating in a venue that was nice but not spectacular. And I was here, having just bought the venue she'd dreamed of. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I hadn't done it for revenge. I'd done it because I knew the Crystal Gardens was a good investment, because I knew I could make it succeed, because I knew that in my first life, this property had been my sister's dream, and it could have been mine too, if I'd had the courage to reach for it. For the first time in either life, I felt something like peace. Emma's wedding photos appeared on social media the next day. She looked beautiful in her gown, though I could see the tension in her smile. The Riverside Inn had done its best, but the decorations looked budget-conscious. The flowers were pretty but sparse. The cake was elegant, but small. Mum had posted a long caption about perfect days and dream weddings and the most beautiful bride. She didn't mention me. I didn't comment. I didn't react. I simply scrolled past and continued with my life. 2 weeks later, my loan approval came through. The Crystal Gardens was officially mine. I threw myself into the renovation work. Mrs. Aldrich had agreed to stay on as a consultant for the first year, teaching me the industry. Together, we hired a new staff, updated the website, created the tiered pricing packages I'd proposed, reached out to wedding planners and photographers and florists to build relationships. The work was exhausting. I spent 12-hour days at the venue, learning every aspect of the business, how to coordinate with caterers, how to handle difficult clients, how to manage the technical aspects of lighting and sound, how to deal with last-minute disasters and make them seem effortless. Mrs. Aldrich was a patient teacher. She'd spent 30 years in the industry and knew every trick, every shortcut, every solution to problems I hadn't even thought of yet. "You remind me of Catherine," she told me one afternoon as we reviewed booking contracts. She had that same intensity, that same drive to make things perfect. "Tell me about her," I said. She did. Catherine had been an event planner who dreamed of opening her own venue. She'd saved for years, researched every detail, drawn up elaborate plans. And then she'd gotten sick. The cancer had been aggressive. She had died before seeing her dream realised, and her mother had tried to build it for her. "But it wasn't the same without her vision," Miss Aldrich said softly. "I was trying to honour her memory, but I was really just keeping a ghost alive. You're different. You're not trying to preserve something dead. You're building something new." "I'm building something that matters," I said. "That's what your daughter wanted too." She smiled, and it was the first time I'd seen her look truly happy. By August, we had bookings every weekend through the end of the year. I didn't reach out to my family. They didn't reach out to me. The silence stretched between us like a chasm neither side felt motivated to cross. I focused on my work, my investments, my property. I renovated Grandma's house, updating the plumbing and electrical while preserving everything that made it special. I turned the second bedroom into a home office. I planted a new section of the garden with Grandma's favourite roses. On weekends, I'd sit on the porch with coffee and watch the neighbourhood wake up. Children riding bikes, couples walking dogs, the ordinary rhythm of life continuing around me. I wasn't lonely. I was alone, and there was a difference. In September, Daniel Reeves showed up at the Crystal Gardens. I was in the main ballroom, discussing lighting arrangements with our technical crew when our receptionist told me someone was asking for me by name. He stood in the lobby, looking exactly as I remembered from my first life. Handsome in a generic way, dressed well but not expensively, that same calculated charm in his expression. "Jenny," he said, approaching with outstretched arms as if we were old friends. "I heard you bought this place. That's incredible." "Thank you." I didn't move to embrace him. His arms dropped awkwardly. "I'm sorry we lost touch. I tried to get in contact a few times, but you never responded." I'd blocked his number after that coffee shop encounter. I'd learned in my first life that Daniel didn't accept rejection well. He simply waited for better opportunities to present themselves. I've been busy, I said. Clearly. He gestured around the lobby. This is impressive. Really impressive. Listen, I'd love to take you to dinner. Catch up properly. Talk about what you've been doing. In my first life, I'd eventually said yes to him. I'd been lonely and hurting from my family's rejection. I'd wanted someone to see me, to value me. He'd seemed like the answer to that longing. Now I saw him for what he was, a man who'd spent months researching me, learned about my grandmother's house and my family's pressure to sell it, and positioned himself to swoop in as my saviour when I was most vulnerable. When that hadn't worked, he'd moved on to other targets. And eventually, he'd found his way to Emma. I'm not interested, I said clearly. His smile faltered. Come on, just one dinner. No pressure. No, thank you. Something flickered behind his eyes. Annoyance, calculation. You don't know what you're missing. Actually, I do. That's why I'm saying no. I walked away before he could respond. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. From anger at who I'd been in my first life. So desperate for approval that I'd accepted crumbs from someone who saw me as a resource to exploit. Never again. That evening, I looked him up on social media. He'd started dating someone new, a girl named Lisa, who worked in finance. The photos showed the same pattern I remembered, him gradually isolating her from friends, positioning himself as her only support, slowly taking control. I sent Lisa a message. Nothing accusatory or dramatic, just, I used to know Daniel. If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here. She didn't respond. But 2 months later, when she finally left him, she reached out. We met for coffee. I listened to her story, hearing my own pain reflected back at me. And I told her she deserved better. That she was strong for leaving. That it wasn't her fault. She cried. Then she thanked me. Then she went home and blocked his number and moved forward with her life. Sometimes saving yourself means saving others too. October brought cooler weather and falling leaves. The Crystal Gardens hosted its first celebrity wedding, a local news anchor whose ceremony got featured in the City magazine. The publicity brought more bookings, more inquiries, more success. I barely noticed when Emma's marriage started showing cracks on social media. The loving couple photos became less frequent. Thomas stopped appearing in her posts altogether. In my first life, their divorce had been dramatic and public. Emma had discovered Thomas in bed with her maid of honour, Lauren, and the subsequent fallout had consumed months of family dinners and tearful phone calls. This time, I watched it unfold from a distance. Mum called once, in November, to tell me Emma was going through something difficult and could use her sister's support. I hope she has someone to talk to, I said sincerely. You could be that person, Mum said, her voice sharp with accusation. I could have been, I agreed. But you uninvited me from her wedding because my presence would create tension. I respected that boundary. I'm still respecting it. You're really going to hold a grudge over that? I'm not holding a grudge. I'm just not available to be needed, only when it's convenient. She hung up without saying goodbye. A week later, Dad called. Your mother is upset. I know. Emma's getting divorced. It's been very hard on everyone. I'm sorry to hear that. Is that all you have to say? What would you like me to say? I'd like you to act like you care about your family. I do care, I replied quietly. But caring doesn't mean setting myself on fire to keep you warm. It doesn't mean sacrificing my boundaries because Emma is hurting. It doesn't mean pretending the last year didn't happen. We're your parents, Jenny. Yes, and I'm your daughter. But you only remember that when you need something from me. He was silent for a moment. You've become very hard. No, I've become clear about my worth. There's a difference. He hung up. I sat in Grandma's kitchen for a long time afterward, drinking tea and watching the November rain fall against the windows. My phone stayed silent. No angry texts, no desperate voicemails, just silence. And I realised I was okay with that. Emma filed for divorce in December, 6 months after her wedding. The Riverside Inn had hosted her ceremony. I wondered if she ever thought about the Crystal Gardens, about the wedding that could have been if she'd had the money. I wondered if she ever thought about where that money could have come from and what I'd lost by giving it to her in my first life. But I didn't dwell on it. I had a business to run, a life to build, a future to secure. In January, 1 year after my rebirth, I received a legal notice. Emma and my parents were contesting Grandma's will. They claimed I'd unduly influenced her, that I'd manipulated her into leaving me the house. They wanted the property sold and the proceeds divided among all the grandchildren, which, practically speaking, meant Emma, since she was the only other one. I read the documents calmly. I'd expected this. In some ways, I'd prepared for it. I hired a lawyer, the best estate attorney in the city. We responded with Grandma's medical records showing her perfect mental competence, her written letters explaining her reasoning, testimony from her lawyer about her clear intentions, testimony from her neighbours about our relationship, photos of us together spanning decades. The evidence was overwhelming. Grandma had been sharp as a tack until the day she died. She'd made her decision deliberately, with full understanding of what it meant. The case was dismissed within 3 months. The judge noted that the suit appeared motivated by financial need rather than legitimate concern about undue influence. My parents were ordered to pay my legal fees. They never apologised. Spring came around again, marking 2 years since my rebirth. The Crystal Gardens had become one of the most sought-after venues in the city. I'd hired additional staff, expanded our services, and purchased the adjacent property to create a garden ceremony space. Mrs. Aldrich had retired at the end of the first year, exactly as planned. She sent me postcards from her travels, Italy, Greece, Japan, living the life she'd dreamed of before Catherine got sick. I was in my office when my receptionist called to say I had visitors. Mum, Dad, and Emma stood in the lobby. They looked older than I remembered, worn down by whatever struggles the past year had brought them. Emma's divorce had been finalised. She'd moved back in with our parents. She looked tired. "Can we talk?" Mum asked. I led them to my office. It overlooked the garden, where a wedding ceremony was being set up for that evening. White chairs arranged in perfect diaxed rows, an arch covered in spring flowers, beauty and new beginnings. "This is quite a place," Dad said, looking around. "Thank you." "We wanted to apologise," Mum said, though her voice lacked conviction. "We've been thinking about everything that happened. We were wrong to pressure you about the house." "Okay," I said. Emma shifted uncomfortably. "I'm getting remarried in June, and I was wondering if maybe you'd let me have my wedding here, at a family discount." There it was, the real reason for this visit, not genuine apology or reconciliation, another request for something they wanted from me. In my first life, I would have said yes. I would have been so grateful for their acknowledgement, so desperate for their approval, that I'd have given them anything they asked for. "No," I said quietly. Emma's face crumpled. "Please, Jenny. I know I messed up before, but this time it's different. This time it's real. I can't afford your rates, but you're my sister." "Exactly," I interrupted. "I'm your sister, not your bank account, not your backup plan, not your shortcut to the life you want without working for it." "That's not fair," Mum said. "Isn't it? You didn't want me at Emma's first wedding because I'd create tension. You sued me to try to take away my inheritance. You've ignored me for 2 years unless you needed something. And now you're here because you want another favour." "Family is supposed to help each other," Dad said. "Family is supposed to love each other," I replied. "Support each other, value each other. You taught me that actions speak louder than words. Your actions have been very clear. So that's it? Emma's voice rose. You're just going to hold this grudge forever? You're going to punish me forever for one mistake? I'm not punishing you. I'm protecting myself. There's a difference. We came here to apologize. You came here to ask for something, I corrected. The apology was just the price of admission. If you truly wanted to reconcile, you wouldn't have led with a request for a favor. Mom stood up, her mouth tight with anger. You've changed. You're not the Jenny we raised. No, I agreed. I'm the Jenny that Grandma raised. The one who learned that anything worth having requires effort. The one who knows her worth doesn't come from how much I can give to people who don't appreciate it. They left without another word. I watched from my office window as they got into their car and drove away. Emma was crying. Mum looked furious. Dad just looked tired. I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not sadness. Just a quiet sense of closure. That evening, I locked up the Crystal Gardens after a beautiful wedding ceremony. The couple had been sweet and genuinely in love, planning their celebration for months on a modest budget. They'd chosen our bronze package, our most affordable option, and had been thrilled with every detail. Watching them dance their first dance, I'd felt something warm settle in my chest. This was why I did this work. Not for the money or the prestige or the revenge, but for these moments of genuine joy. Emma's second wedding happened at a small venue outside the city. I saw the photos online, modest but sweet. She looked happier than she had at her first wedding, less concerned with impressing others and more focused on the moment itself. Her new husband was named David. He worked as a teacher. He looked kind. I hoped it was real this time. I hoped she'd learned something from the pain of her first marriage. I hoped she'd find the happiness she was looking for. But whether she had or hadn't, it was no longer my problem to solve. 3 years after my rebirth, the Crystal Gardens expanded again. We added a second ballroom, a bridal suite, and a catering kitchen that allowed us to provide full-service packages. We'd hosted over 300 weddings and become the premier venue in the entire region. I stood in Grandma's garden one Saturday morning, the tomatoes ripening in the summer sun. I'd kept the house exactly as she'd left it, visiting every weekend to maintain the garden and feel close to her memory. You were right, I said aloud, though I was alone. Anything worth having requires effort. The effort to rebuild my life, the effort to set boundaries, the effort to believe I deserved more than scraps, the effort to forgive myself for the mistakes of my first life and use my second chance wisely. In my first life, I died broken and alone, convinced I was worthless because my family had treated me that way and I'd believed them. In this life, I'd learned that their inability to see my value said nothing about my worth. Their neglect had been their failure, not mine. I thought about Daniel sometimes, wondered what he was doing. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd gotten married, then divorced, then remarried. Some people never changed their patterns. They just found new targets. I thought about Emma too, hoped she'd found genuine happiness with David, hoped she'd learned that love couldn't be bought or borrowed or taken, that it had to be earned through mutual respect and genuine care. But mostly, I thought about myself, about the girl who'd walked into the lake, believing she had nothing left to live for, about the woman I'd become who knew her worth came from within, not from others' recognition of it. The evening sun cast long shadows across the garden. I finished watering the tomatoes and sat on the porch, watching the light fade. The wood beneath me was the same wood Grandma had sat on. The view was the same view she'd loved. The peace was the same peace she'd tried to teach me. Inside the house, my phone buzzed with notifications, booking requests, business inquiries, messages from my staff about upcoming events. I didn't check them right away. For this moment, I just sat in the stillness, breathing in the smell of growing things, feeling the solid weight of the porch beneath me, the same porch where Grandma had taught me to watch storms, to wait for calm, to trust that difficult weather would pass. "Thank you," I whispered, "for the house, for the lessons, for believing in me when no one else did, for giving me something worth fighting for when I needed it most." The sky deepened to purple, then navy, then black. Stars appeared one by one. I stayed on the porch until the air grew cool, until the night sounds replaced the day sounds, until I felt completely at peace with the life I'd built from the ashes of my first one. Then I stood, locked the door, and drove back to my apartment in the city. Tomorrow, the Crystal Gardens would host 3 weddings. Tomorrow, I would meet with architects about expanding our outdoor ceremony space. Tomorrow, I would interview candidates for our new event coordinator position. Tomorrow, I would continue building something lasting and real. But tonight, I was simply Jenny, granddaughter, business owner, survivor, the girl who'd been given a second chance and had used it to save herself. The woman who'd learned that sometimes the greatest revenge isn't vengeance at all. It's building a life so full and rich and meaningful that those who rejected you become irrelevant to your happiness. I'd been given a second chance, and I'd used it not to punish those who'd hurt me, but to free myself from needing their approval. And in the end, that was the only rebirth that mattered. I'd died once, believing I was nothing. I'd lived again, proving I was everything. The old Jenny had needed her family's love to feel worthy. The new Jenny had learned that the only love she truly needed was her own. That was the real transformation. That was the real victory. Not the business success or the financial security or the karmic justice of owning the venue Emma had wanted. The victory was waking up each morning and knowing, bone deep and certain, that I was enough exactly as I was, that I always had been, and that I always would be.